In the hushed corridors of a marble-floored mansion, one seemingly invincible man stood on the brink of losing everything. Beneath the glittering chandeliers and the watchful gaze of ancestral portraits, a secret festered, one that would fracture his glamorous world and spill betrayal into every room. This is the story of how Alexander Aldridge, heir to a colossal fortune, forsook his pregnant wife to chase forbidden passion in Paris. But fate did not forget his cruelty. When his wife reappeared child in arms at the most pivotal moment of his life, Alexander would learn a haunting truth. All the money on earth can't bury past sins. Alexander Aldridge was born into privilege, but not softness. His family's estate, known as Greycliff Manor, stood on a sprawling acreage just outside Boston, a grand ivy-draped mansion built by his great-grandfather in 1912. Marble columns framed the entrance, and wrought iron gates guarded secrets as fiercely as they guarded wealth. The Aldridges were known for their philanthropy, appearing in the Boston Globe's society pages, for funding libraries and hospitals. Yet behind every philanthropic success lay an unspoken demand for loyalty and a sense of duty to preserve the family name. As a child, Alexander was instructed in etiquette by Miss Miranda, a strict governess imported from England. By age 10, he could discuss fine art, give a speech at a charity gala, and analyze the stock market, a curious skill nurtured by his father, Henry Aldridge, who believed that if his son was to helm the family business, he had best start young. The boy's days were scheduled with militaristic precision piano practice, at dawn tennis lessons, at noon academic tutoring, in the afternoon and dinner with his parents, always requiring a starched shirt and a straight spine. The Aldridge fortune originated from shipping and railroads, then diversified into real estate and technology as the world evolved. Their name adorned several prominent buildings in New York and Boston, and Henry Aldridge sat on the boards of multiple Fortune 500 companies. However, pride held a potent place in the family psyche. Henry would not tolerate weaknesses or compromises, especially not from his heir. Alexander grew into a tall, poised young man, with an air of confidence that could easily be mistaken for arrogance. By the time he graduated from Harvard Business School, he was already securing multi-million-dollar deals for Aldridge International. He admired real-world tycoons like Warren Buffett for their business acumen and read widely about Elon Musk's ventures, dreaming of a day when Aldridge International could penetrate new markets: space exploration, renewable energy, the cutting edge of biotech. Most who saw Alexander from the outside believed he had it all: a brilliant mind, a legendary family name, and the discipline to secure an even brighter future. Yet in the hush of his private chambers, he felt a perpetual emptiness. It was the kind of hollowness that no gilded hall or philanthropic accolade could fill. The friction with Henry never dissolved. It only intensified with Alexander's adulthood. The tension was not the product of hatred, but of unrelenting expectation. Every day was a test. Every success led to a new, more impossible standard. Henry reminded him of that daily saying, "We are Aldridges, we don't merely compete, we dominate." But sometimes Alexander wondered if there was space in his life for anything beyond conquest. Indeed, lurking beneath his immaculate suits and courtesy-laden manner was a longing for freedom he had yet to articulate. Charlotte Winters entered Alexander's life during a gala at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. A dazzling event sponsored by the Aldridge Foundation, the evening was designed to celebrate new acquisitions and raise funds for the museum's ongoing expansions. Charlotte was a junior curator, her eyes gleaming with excitement and sincerity when discussing Baroque art. There was something genuine in Charlotte that Alexander craved. Far from the socialites that had been foisted upon him at debutante balls and high society mixers, she was fresh, earnest, unpretentious. She spoke her mind, even if it contradicted his. That evening, while standing in front of a Caravaggio painting, she criticized the museum's lighting choices, unaware that the man in front of her bankrolled half the event. He smiled, intrigued by her candor. Their courtship was swift, but passionate. She introduced him to a side of life unguarded by brand names and board meetings. They walked through Central Park, shared street vendor pretzels, visited obscure art galleries in Chelsea. She taught him to slow down, to see beauty beyond spreadsheets and profit margins. Henry Aldridge had reservations. Charlotte was not from a prominent family. Her father was a retired schoolteacher, her mother a homemaker. But Henry, a practical man, recognized that Alexander wasn't easily deterred. If this woman gave his son a measure of happiness, and if she didn't threaten the family's wealth and reputation, Henry would give his guarded approval. And so Alexander and Charlotte wed in a grand ceremony at Greycliff Manor. The bride wore a satin gown, the groom a bespoke Briony tuxedo. Society columnists raved about the union, lauding Charlotte's down-to-earth grace and hailing her as the perfect complement to Alexander's polished ambition. For a few years, the marriage thrived on mutual respect. Charlotte gravitated more toward philanthropic work, championing child literacy programs sponsored by the Aldridge Foundation. She grew closer to Henry than Alexander ever expected, often helping him organize events and fundraisers, bridging the generational gap. Alexander, meanwhile, found solace in Charlotte's gentle presence. She reminded him that life could be more than endless expansions and acquisitions. However, as Alexander's responsibilities multiplied, especially after Henry's health began a slow but noticeable decline, he threw himself deeper into the corporate world. Long nights in the office, frequent flights to Singapore or Dubai, and relentless board meetings. Charlotte tried to be supportive, but she felt him slipping away. Cracks formed. The tension Henry had once inflicted on Alexander was now magnified on the younger man. After all, if the elder Aldridge was nearing the end, Alexander had to prove himself worthy. He wanted to honor the man who had shaped him, even as he resented the ceaseless demands. Thus, unbeknownst to Charlotte, Alexander's heart became a battlefield between love and ambition. Lorraine Carlyle was first introduced to the Aldridge orbit at a lavish charity auction in Los Angeles. A leggy blonde with a piercing gaze, she was rumored to be the daughter of an exiled European noble and an American heiress. Her background was murky, but her connections were extensive. People whispered that she had ties to big Hollywood producers and occasionally appeared in cameo roles. She had an intoxicating aura about her, spirited, confident, and unafraid to flirt brazenly with the city's elite. Alexander saw her across a crowd of socialites wearing a midnight blue gown slit high on the thigh. She sipped champagne as though she were queen of the event, neither starstruck nor intimidated by wealth. She spotted Alexander almost immediately, her eyes flickered with recognition, the corners of her mouth curving into a predatory smile. They exchanged polite greetings, each name-dropping philanthropic causes and business acquaintances. Lorraine volunteered at a Los Angeles art house to help struggling filmmakers. Alexander talked about the expansions of the Aldridge Foundation's film restoration program. The synergy was instantaneous. Over the next few weeks, they met again at business gatherings, always in public spaces, always with a veneer of professional courtesy. Yet a current of raw tension ran beneath their interactions. Lorraine was unlike Charlotte. She was brazen, unapologetically ambitious, and she recognized in Alexander a man on a perpetual quest for something more. She teased him about his uptight suits, boasted of her escapades in Monte Carlo, and painted vivid pictures of exotic locales he had never had time to properly enjoy. Alexander told himself it was harmless banter, a dinner here, a stolen conversation there. But Lorraine's magnetism was relentless. She awakened a side of him that craved excitement, novelty, a break from the rigors of the Aldridge name. Soon, texts flew back and forth, flirty messages at 2 a.m., suggestions of secret rendezvous. The boundary of mere friendship blurred, and Alexander found himself stepping onto a treacherous path. He convinced himself Charlotte was better off not knowing about the emotional storms swirling within him. Their marriage, once a source of light, now felt overshadowed by corporate demands and paternal expectations. Surely, he reasoned, he deserved a little excitement after all he'd sacrificed. And Lorraine's invitation was tempting. "Come with me to Paris," she whispered one night, "just for a weekend. No strings attached." In the quiet corners of his conscience, Alexander felt guilt gnawing at him. But logic gave way to longing. With Henry's health growing more precarious, Alexander knew his time for personal indulgences might be limited. The flame Lorraine offered, however dangerous, was brighter than the dull routine he had come to accept. So he accepted her invitation, telling Charlotte a half-truth about a sudden business meeting in Europe. No sooner had he made this decision than forces beyond his control began unraveling everything he thought was secure. While Alexander prepared for his business trip with mounting excitement, Charlotte discovered she was pregnant. She had suspected for several weeks, experiencing waves of nausea in the mornings and an uncharacteristic fatigue. A home test confirmed her intuition. The immediate warmth in her chest was tempered by a swirl of fear. She had dreamt of starting a family with Alexander, yet their marriage had grown distant. Would this news rekindle their bond or plunge them into further strain? With trembling hands, she texted Alexander. He was boarding a flight to Paris at the time, his phone set to silent. When he finally emerged at Charles de Gaulle, an avalanche of messages awaited him. Missed calls from Charlotte, multiple texts urging him to call home, and even an email from Henry's chief nurse asking him to check on his father. The situation had changed dramatically. Henry had collapsed the night before. The doctors suspected a stroke. He was at Massachusetts General Hospital, condition critical. Caught in the swirl of Lorraine's seductive promise, he had planned a luxurious stay at the Hotel Ritz, complete with Michelin-star dinners. Alexander now had a desperate choice: return immediately to Boston to stand by his father's side and learn more about Charlotte's urgent messages, or stay in Paris. Lorraine, seeing the panic in his eyes, placed a hand on his arm and said, "We only have this moment, darling." Perhaps it was her beauty, the siren call of his own rebellion, or the fear of confronting his father's mortality, but Alexander decided to stay for at least one night. One night extended into 2, then 3. His father lingered in a coma. Charlotte, worrying about her husband's absence, felt her heartbreak intensify. Yet the demands of the Aldridge family empire ground on. As the crisis at home worsened, Alexander tried to split his attention, calling doctors in Boston while strolling the streets of Paris with Lorraine. He rationalized that if Henry truly needed him, he would be summoned more urgently, forgetting that his father's personal nurse had already tried precisely that. Meanwhile, Charlotte, alone in the hospital corridors, overcame her initial devastation with steely resolve. She heard Henry's faint pulse, stood watch by his bed, and arranged for top specialists to be flown in from Johns Hopkins. She called the Aldridge board members lawyers and accountants, coordinating everything that Alexander would have typically handled. And all this while she was newly pregnant, feeling more alone by the hour. The heartbreak stung, but an unborn life gave her a new source of determination. If Alexander couldn't be present, she would be. In Paris, Alexander reveled in an affair that felt surreal, as if it existed outside the boundaries of time. He and Lorraine dined at Le Jules Verne on the Eiffel Tower's second floor, sipping Dom Perignon as they looked out over the city of lights. They explored the Champs-Élysées, visited the Louvre after hours, thanks to Lorraine's connections, and toasted each other's so-called freedom in hidden jazz bars on the left bank. Each night, he faced his phone with increasing trepidation. Dozens of notifications lit his screen, messages from Charlotte, from the hospital, from Aldridge International board members. Lorraine would roll her eyes, urging him to turn the device off. "You deserve a life that isn't chained to your father's legacy," she purred. "Let me show you how alive you can feel." Seductive words indeed, especially to a man who had never known a life free of expectations. Yet guilt ate at him in quiet moments. He found himself staring off into space, thinking of Henry's strong voice, now silenced, of Charlotte, waiting with a burden he had only glimpsed. One evening, as Lorraine slept in their opulent suite at the Hotel Ritz, Alexander crept onto the balcony. He dialed the hospital. Charlotte answered, exhausted. Her voice wavered between relief and anger. "How could you be gone at a time like this? Your father, my pregnancy. Don't you understand how serious it is?" Stunned, Alexander asked her to repeat herself. "Pregnancy." The phone line crackled, an unwanted hush settling. Charlotte explained that she'd discovered the news days before. He struggled to form coherent words. Both fatherhood and the looming potential loss of his father seized him in a vice of dread and guilt. With tears in her voice, Charlotte told him to come home if he still cared. Then she hung up. Lorraine woke to find Alexander shaken. He explained the situation, vaguely blaming family troubles, but did not mention the pregnancy. She saw that the adventure was slipping through her fingers and made an unspoken decision: she would keep him close at any cost. "I'll come with you," she offered, trailing her hands over his shoulders. "We'll face it together." But Alexander had no intention of unveiling his illicit relationship in Boston. That would be a betrayal too far, even for him. He told Lorraine to wait in Paris. He'd return soon. She pouted, but relented, kissing him passionately as he left for the airport. His heart hammered with anxiety as he wondered, was it already too late to salvage what remained of his life? Alexander arrived at Massachusetts General Hospital to find Charlotte asleep in a chair next to Henry's bed, dark circles under her eyes. Nurses whispered that she'd barely left the room for days. The baby weighed on her mind, a fragile source of hope. She was no longer merely Henry's caretaker. She was also the steward of the Aldridge lineage. When she opened her eyes and saw Alexander, a storm of emotions crossed her face. Relief, anger, betrayal. "You're back," she said softly. Her voice was as cold as the sterile walls around them. He took a step toward her, but she held up a hand to keep distance. "Henry's stable for now," she continued. "But the doctors don't know if he'll fully recover. We've had to manage a crisis at Aldridge International. And I've been alone in this." Her words cut through him, laced with the unspoken question, "Where have you been?" He stammered an apology, citing a business trip he couldn't postpone. Charlotte's gaze flickered with hurt. "You missed the chance to see him lucid," she murmured, voice trembling. "He woke once." just long enough to look around and ask for you. Despite the tension, he tried to reconcile, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. I'm here now. I won't leave again. Charlotte said nothing, turning her attention to the slow beeping of Henry's heart monitor. Alexander spent the next hours speaking to doctors, gathering updates on the family business, and ignoring Lorraine's incessant texts. I miss you. Come back soon. I need to see you. Aldridge International was bracing for a power shift. Word had spread that Henry's condition was dire, prompting board members and executives to circle like sharks. The question of inheritance loomed large. Henry Aldridge's personal assets were vast, and the structure of his will had always been ambiguous. Rumors suggested that Henry had established a unique arrangement, possibly involving charities and trust funds. Some speculated that Charlotte, if pregnant with the next Aldridge heir, would become the wealthiest woman in Boston. In the following days, Charlotte's pregnancy became an open secret among the staff. The press started sniffing around after an insider leaked hospital records. The Boston Globe ran a subtle piece, a new heir for the Aldridge dynasty. Alexander tried to shield Charlotte from the paparazzi, but the fortress of Greycliff Manor couldn't keep out prying eyes forever. In private, behind locked bedroom doors, Charlotte confronted Alexander. Need the truth. Where were you? Who were you with? Her eyes flickered with pain, and he hated himself for causing it. Yet he lied again. It was just business, Charlotte. I had to close a deal in Europe. I'm sorry the timing was so poor. She studied his face, searching for sincerity, but found only the hollow ring of half-truths. With no energy left to argue, she turned away. 2 weeks passed. Henry remained comatose. Alexander juggled crisis management at Aldridge International, and Charlotte's pregnancy advanced. The strain took a toll on both of them. She moved out of their bedroom and stayed in a guest suite, refusing to pretend that all was well. Alexander told himself he'd find the right time to explain everything that he needed to protect her from the blow of his affair. In his darkest moments, however, he suspected the best protection would have been faithfulness. Meanwhile, Lorraine simmered in Paris. Her calls to Alexander became more frequent and urgent. I'm losing patience, she warned. Don't forget the promise you made. You said you'd return. She hinted at a potential scandal if he abandoned her. Alexander's illusions about a casual fling were evaporating. In a panic, he arranged for her to travel discreetly to a friend's estate in the French countryside, providing her with money and empty assurances that he'd sort everything out soon. Every day that Henry remained in a coma chipped away at Alexander's composure. Lawyers from Cravath, Swain and Moore, a renowned New York firm, descended on Greycliff Manor to review Henry's estate. They told Alexander and Charlotte that a reading of the will would occur once Henry's fate was definitively known, either recovery or death. The hospital insisted they keep him on life support unless there was no chance of revival. Tensions rose, fueled by speculation. If Henry died now, who would inherit Alexander, the unborn child? Or were there elaborate trusts that would transform everything? Charlotte dreaded these discussions. She cared less about the money than about the moral quagmire. Alexander stood on the precipice of fatherhood, but she questioned whether he was even willing or able to be a genuine partner. She remembered the man she married, kind, compassionate, quietly humorous, and compared him to this restless, haunted figure who paced the halls like he was searching for an escape. Then late one night, Charlotte felt sharp cramps. Fear gripped her. She was barely 6 months pregnant. She doubled over alone in her suite, sweat beading her forehead. Alexander, in another part of the manor, heard her cries and rushed in. He found her curled on the floor, one hand clutching her belly, tears streaming down her face. The frantic dash to the hospital that night made them both realize how delicate life truly was. The doctors managed to stabilize her, explaining that she was suffering from stress-induced complications. If she continued under such pressure, the baby might come prematurely or worse. Alexander stayed by her bedside, guilt piling on him like bricks in a collapsing wall. He wanted to confess everything, Paris, Lorraine, the betrayal. But Charlotte was too fragile now. The weight of the secret bore down on him as they faced the possibility of losing their child. Winter bore down on Boston with an unrelenting force. Snow fell in thick, blinding sheets, silencing the city beneath a frozen white blanket. At Greycliff Manor, the world outside was muffled, the estate isolated by drifted roads and downed power lines. Inside Charlotte Winters, Aldridge was pacing her suite, one hand pressed to her lower back, the other gripping the edge of the antique writing desk. Pain struck again, sharper this time, lower and deeper. She knew the baby was coming. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand, a reminder of how alone she truly was. She had tried calling Alexander hours earlier. No response. He was in a board meeting, or so she'd been told. He always was these days, meeting statements handling Lorraine. The thought of Lorraine made bile rise in her throat. Charlotte took a shaky breath. Her doctor had warned her that premature labor was a possibility, especially given the stress of the past few weeks. But no warning could prepare her for what it felt like now, with no one by her side. She called the hospital. Their response was grim. The storm had crippled half the city's emergency routes. Ambulances were backed up. They'd dispatch help, but it might be hours. She swallowed a scream. Staggering into the hallway, she called for the house staff, but most had already left ahead of the storm. Only a skeleton crew remained, an elderly groundskeeper and a maid who barely spoke English. Neither was trained for a medical emergency. A sense of mounting terror clamped down on her chest. She tried calling her father, her closest friend, her OB. No signal. She was completely alone. A fierce contraction buckled her knees. Crying out, she stumbled into the library, Henry's library, once a place of legacy and silence. Now she was about to fill it with the raw sounds of labor. She collapsed onto the rug beneath the grand portrait of Henry himself. She almost laughed at the irony birthing the next Aldridge heir beneath the watchful eyes of a man who had obsessed over legacy. Crawling to her phone, she called the only person she thought might help, her college roommate, now a nurse. Miraculously, the call connected. With trembling hands, she placed the phone on speaker, propped it against a book, and followed the calm, steady instructions being relayed to her from miles away. Breathe, Char, you're going to be okay. You can do this. Every contraction felt like her body was being torn in two. Sweat drenched her back. She cried, whimpered, gasped, until she couldn't make any sound at all. The maid found her just as the baby's head began to crown. Charlotte screamed, gripping the leg of a coffee table, tears and fear blurring her vision. She barely registered the maid kneeling beside her, whispering prayers in broken English. Minutes stretched like hours. Then at last it happened. The baby came. A cry, faint but fierce, cut through the silence like a sword. Charlotte wept with disbelief as her child, her son, was wrapped in a towel from the nearest bathroom and placed into her trembling arms. He was small, red-faced, and breathing, alive. Somehow, against all odds, they had made it. Paramedics arrived 20 minutes later, breathless and shocked to find the heir to the Aldridge fortune already delivered by candlelight and courage. As they wheeled Charlotte and the baby to the waiting ambulance, she kept her son clutched tightly to her chest, refusing to let him go. Alexander arrived at the hospital several hours later, breathless and frantic after finally receiving the messages. He rushed to her room, guilt etched into every line of his face. Charlotte didn't look at him when he entered. She simply said, "Your son is here, and I brought him into this world alone." He tried to speak, to offer apologies, explanations, something, but she turned away. And in that turn, he saw what he had truly lost. The days following the emergency birth were a blur of white corridors, whispered updates, and long hours spent by the incubator in the NICU. Charlotte barely slept. The baby, though premature, was strong, a boy with Alexander's eyes, and her chin a tiny bundle swaddled in uncertainty and hope. Nurses came and went. Monitors beeped with rhythmic constancy. But it was the silence, the deep aching silence between her and Alexander, that rang the loudest. Charlotte moved on autopilot, tending to her fragile newborn, with the ferocity only a mother could muster. Visitors were turned away, messages unanswered. She wanted no sympathy, no platitudes, only stability for the life she had brought into the world alone. Alexander, to his credit, did not disappear. He came to the hospital daily, sometimes bringing coffee, sometimes nothing but apologies in his eyes. He asked to hold the baby. Sometimes Charlotte allowed it. Sometimes she didn't. She hadn't forgiven him, not for Paris, not for his lies, and certainly not for the presence that loomed just beyond the hospital walls, Lorraine Carlyle. Lorraine, emboldened by scandal and fueled by pride, had wasted no time in capitalizing on the chaos. She strutted through Boston's shopping districts with designer bags on her arms and paparazzi at her heels. Rumors of her pregnancy circled the tabloids like sharks in bloodied water. Gossip blogs speculated on everything from the paternity of her unborn child to whether she had intentionally engineered the entire affair for financial gain. Charlotte tried to ignore the noise, but even behind hospital walls, it crept in. The headlines were everywhere. The other Aldridge heir. From mistress to mother, Lorraine's high-stakes move. Millionaire's wife gives birth alone, while heiress-in-waiting dines in Milan. It was cruel, but it was working. Lorraine was fast becoming a media sensation, positioning herself as the misunderstood woman caught in a modern love triangle. In reality, she was orchestrating her visibility, carefully pressuring Alexander, undermining Charlotte, and subtly threatening legal action. "She's threatening to file for paternity recognition," Charlotte's attorney informed her one morning. "If granted, her child will be entitled to a share of the Aldridge inheritance." Charlotte remained silent, her gaze fixed on the sleeping baby beside her. Then she said with quiet determination, "Let her try." Meanwhile, Alexander's world began to tilt on a new axis. The board at Aldridge International grew restless. Investors whispered about moral clauses, about his judgment, about the headlines tarnishing the Aldridge brand. Henry's will was still under review, and the specter of a contested inheritance loomed. He felt as though he were being swallowed alive by regret, by responsibility, by the legacy he had once believed he controlled. He spent his days bouncing between the hospital and meetings with lawyers. At night, he received constant messages from Lorraine, some sweet, some demanding, some outright threatening. One read, "If I'm left out, I go public. I have everything saved. You made promises. Keep them." He didn't reply. He couldn't. He had already destroyed one family. He wouldn't let Lorraine manipulate her way into controlling what was left. At the same time, Charlotte, emotionally and physically drained, began to regain her footing. As her son gained strength in the NICU, so did she. She met with trustees, ensured her legal rights as the baby's guardian were in place, and began to reassert herself not as a victim, but as a mother protecting her child's legacy. She no longer sought reconciliation. She sought resolution. And that resolution would come with the will's reading, a formal hearing attended by family lawyers, and now, thanks to Lorraine's meddling, the world's attention. But even before the gavel would strike, Charlotte already knew the truth. No courtroom verdict could restore what was lost, but it could protect what mattered most. The study at Greycliff Manor had never been so full nor so still. The legacy-laden room, lined with cherrywood bookshelves, rich Persian rugs, and Henry Aldridge's ancestral portraits, was now the stage for one of the most explosive moments in the family's history. The reading of the will, a ritual that was typically private and somber, had taken on the air of a televised courtroom drama. Bartholomew Green, Henry Aldridge's longtime estate attorney, stood at the head of the table, his expression a masterclass in composure. Beside him sat two junior legal aids folders stacked neatly at their elbows. Several senior board members of Aldridge International lined one side of the room, their faces taut with curiosity and concern. On the opposite side, Charlotte sat stiffly, her infant son cradled in her arms, his soft breathing the only sound she cared to hear. She wore a modest black dress, her posture poised but emotionally guarded. Alexander sat beside her, visibly uncomfortable in his tailored suit. His eyes were sunken, his hands restless, his mind racing with what he feared might unfold. And then, as if conjured by fate's cruel hand, the double doors burst open. Lorraine Carlyle stepped inside. Every head turned. She wore a sleek wool coat, the color of ink. Her blonde hair swept into a perfectly messy chignon. A pearl-studded clutch swung from her wrist. She walked with the confidence of someone who had just set a match to dry timber and was waiting for the flames to rise. "I have a right to be here," she said smoothly, holding up a folder. "I'm carrying Alexander's child." Gasps echoed. The room froze. Charlotte's arms instinctively tightened around her son. Alexander stood so quickly, his chair scraped the wood floor behind him. "Lorraine, this is not the place." "It is exactly the place," she shot back. "We're discussing inheritance. You didn't think your other child deserved to be accounted for." Bartholomew Green raised a hand. "Miss Carlyle, this is a formal legal proceeding. If you have claims, they should be submitted through appropriate channels." "I've submitted them," she said, handing over the folder. Signed affidavits, prenatal records, a statement from Alexander acknowledging our relationship. "I want this on record before you read a single word of that will." Charlotte's face went pale, but she didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her silence radiated betrayal far louder than any accusation. Green accepted the folder with visible unease. "Very well. The documents will be reviewed separately. For now, we proceed with Mr. Aldridge's testament." He opened the mahogany box and unfolded the parchment. His voice, firm and deliberate, filled the room. Henry's will began as expected donations to various charities, trust funds for staff members, allocations for the Aldridge Foundation's future endeavors. Then the core of the estate, its financial empire and real estate assets, was addressed. "To my son, Alexander Aldridge Green, read a conditional inheritance, stock options, access to family properties, and a yearly disbursement contingent upon continued leadership of Aldridge International and upholding the Aldridge name with dignity and moral clarity. A pause. Green cleared his throat. The will further includes a moral clause. If at the time of my death, Alexander is found to be engaged in conduct that brings disrepute to the Aldridge name, particularly marital infidelity, then said inheritance will be transferred into a managed trust overseen by court-appointed fiduciaries until such time as his children reach the age of 25. Gasps rippled again. Charlotte closed her eyes, a single tear slipping down her cheek. Lorraine's triumph dulled. Alexander stood heart-hammering in his chest. What does this mean exactly? Green looked up, voice grave. It means, Mr. Aldridge, that your actions, if deemed a violation of this clause, strip you of direct control over the estate. Your children will inherit. You, however, will not. The room erupted in murmurs. Charlotte's attorney leaned in, whispering into her ear. Lorraine paled, slightly suddenly aware that even as a mother of an heir, her own access to the fortune might be limited. Charlotte finally stood, her voice steady, despite the betrayal roaring in her blood. So both our children, mine already born, and hers if proven, inherit. And Alexander is removed from the equation entirely. That is correct, Green replied. Judge Whitfield, seated as an independent arbiter in this unique private hearing, asked for silence. We are in possession of verified paternity documentation for the child in Mrs. Aldridge's arms, she said. A court-ordered test is pending for Miss Carlyle. Once verified, appropriate trust structures will be established for both heirs. As for Mr. Aldridge, his status is suspended pending further legal review. Alexander couldn't speak. He looked at Charlotte, eyes pleading. She didn't blink. Lorraine, sensing the shift, tried to assert herself. I deserve to help manage the trust for my child. I'm his mother. Judge Whitfield shut that down. Miss Carlyle, your involvement will be evaluated for fitness. Your conduct, media behavior, and financial responsibility will all be reviewed. The court will decide who is qualified. Lorraine flinched, but said nothing further. Green resumed finishing the will. It is Mr. Aldridge's wish that the family legacy be protected not by titles or bloodlines alone, but by character. And character, as he wrote, must be proven in action. With that, the document concluded. There was no applause, no congratulations, just silence. A silence heavy with consequences. Alexander slumped back in his seat, a man unraveling. Lorraine stood, stiffly defeated, but not dismissed. And Charlotte held her son closer, her spine straightened by the storm. She had lost much, but she had not lost herself. When the proceedings adjourned, no one moved for a long time. Then, with quiet grace, Charlotte rose and walked out, her child, her dignity, and her future intact. The fallout from the inheritance hearing spread like wildfire. Within hours, news networks picked up the story, spinning it into a full-blown media spectacle. Headlines screamed from every corner of the internet. Heir exposed, Aldridge love triangle shocks, high society, 2 women, 2 children, 1 empire in limbo. Scandal at Greycliff, who will control the Aldridge fortune? Greycliff Manor, once a symbol of refined exclusivity, now found itself under siege by paparazzi and curious onlookers. Drone footage of the mansion's sprawling grounds, aired alongside split-screen interviews with so-called society experts, dissecting every angle of the drama. Charlotte became the reluctant epicenter. She avoided the cameras, shuttling between the hospital and her private quarters, with the baby refusing interviews and turning away well-meaning friends who wanted to check in. Her focus narrowed into one singular purpose: protecting her son. Every cry from the newborn in the night reminded her of the silence she'd endured during labor. Every coo felt like a balm over a wound not yet healed. Alexander had failed her at the most critical moment, and now even with his renewed presence, she kept him at arm's length. Let the lawyers handle everything, she told her attorney flatly. I have nothing left to say to him. Alexander, meanwhile, found himself ensnared between damage control and emotional collapse. Lorraine's revelation had blindsided him. Though he hadn't fully believed she was pregnant, the paternity test had erased any doubt. The child was his. She had called it her victory, but to Alexander it felt like another nail in the coffin of his crumbling identity. Lorraine, on the other hand, reveled in her new fame. Boston's paparazzi caught her leaving luxury spas and high-end maternity boutiques. She gave a statement to a gossip magazine insisting, I'm not here to start drama, I just want what's fair for my baby. Her legal team filed papers seeking recognition of her unborn child as a rightful heir to the Aldridge estate. Behind closed doors, however, Lorraine was far less polished. She bombarded Alexander with texts and voicemails, some pleading, some threatening. You said we'd have a future, she hissed in one voice memo. You're not shutting me out now. Alexander ignored her as best he could, but the guilt gnawed at him. Lorraine was part of his past, an indulgence, a mistake, but now she was a permanent fixture in his future, tethered by blood. He had no illusions of rekindling a relationship, yet he couldn't turn away from the life growing inside her. At the same time, he longed for Charlotte, for her calm steadiness, her quiet strength. He had hurt her deeply, perhaps irreparably, and yet he hoped foolishly that she might someday see him not as a man defined by his mistakes, but by his efforts to atone. But Charlotte was not easily moved. In the aftermath of the hearing, she kept her emotions guarded. Her primary concern was her child's stability and security. She took her trustee role seriously, meeting with lawyers, financial advisors, and members of the Aldridge Foundation to ensure funds were used ethically and responsibly. Her name now appeared in business journals under headlines like Graceful Guardian, Charlotte Aldridge, reclaims family legacy. Privately, she wrestled with her heartbreak. Some nights she found herself staring out the window, remembering the man she had married, the man who once brought her coffee on rainy mornings and whispered about baby names during lazy Sunday strolls. She still loved the memory of that man, but she no longer recognized him in the one who had returned from Paris with secrets and shame. Alexander sent her a message one evening. I never meant to hurt you. I failed you. But please don't let my mistakes define who I am to our son. Charlotte read it, then deleted it. She couldn't respond. Not yet. She needed time not just to heal, but to rediscover the part of herself that had once trusted so easily, loved so fully. Until then, Alexander would remain in limbo, a father with obligations, a man with consequences, torn between two worlds he had created with his own hands. The Boston courthouse stood like a fortress against the biting winter wind, its granite pillars looming beneath a slate-gray sky. Inside, tension buzzed in the air as spectators filled every available seat. Reporters huddled near the back pens and cameras, poised to capture what was already being called the Aldridge inheritance showdown. Charlotte sat at the plaintiff's table, calm on the outside. But inside, her pulse thudded like a drumbeat. Her attorney, a seasoned Boston litigator named Eleanor Briggs, whispered last-minute updates beside her. Charlotte's baby, just weeks old, was in the care of a trusted friend just outside the courtroom. Though physically exhausted, emotionally depleted, Charlotte had summoned her last reserves of strength for this moment. She would not let Henry Aldridge's legacy or her child's future be defined by deceit. Across the aisle, Alexander sat rigidly, jaw clenched. His once effortless confidence had dulled into something more fragile, uncertainty, perhaps even shame. Lorraine Carlyle arrived moments later, flanked by a lawyer and flanked by flashes of paparazzi outside. Dressed in black, like she was attending a funeral, she exuded drama, greeting the room with a proud tilt of her chin. Judge Marianne Whitfield, a formidable figure with salt and pepper hair and a reputation for cutting through theatrics, entered promptly at 10:00 a.m. The room quieted instantly as she took the bench. "Let's proceed," she said, without preamble. "We are here to examine claims related to the estate of the late Henry Aldridge and to determine the legal standing of potential heirs and guardianship matters as stipulated in the will." First came the reading of the paternity test results. An envelope was passed to the judge by a clerk, and she opened it with a practiced hand. The court acknowledges that based on these findings, Mr. Alexander Aldridge is the biological father of Ms. Lorraine Carlyle's unborn child. A murmur swept through the room. Charlotte sat stone still, eyes fixed ahead. She had suspected as much, but the confirmation still hit like a blow to the chest. Lorraine gave a self-satisfied smirk, her hand moving instinctively to her barely visible bump. But the courtroom had more twists to offer. Bartholomew Green, Henry Aldridge's longtime estate lawyer, stood slowly and cleared his throat. "Your Honor, if it pleases the court, I have just received authorization to present an additional codicil, an amendment to Mr. Aldridge's will discovered in a secured lockbox at Greycliff Manor." Judge Whitfield raised an eyebrow. "Proceed." Green continued, "This codicil introduces what Mr. Aldridge termed a moral turpitude clause. It stipulates that if his son, Mr. Alexander Aldridge, is found to have engaged in acts that damage the family's reputation, particularly involving infidelity, or actions that compromise the dignity of the Aldridge name, his direct inheritance shall be suspended. Control of all assets and trusts shall be placed in a panel of court-appointed trustees with fiduciary rights passing to the Aldridge heirs upon reaching adulthood." The air in the courtroom went thin. Charlotte inhaled sharply, hand clutching the edge of the table. Lorraine looked momentarily startled, then indignant. Alexander's face turned pale, a thousand regrets crashing over him at once. Judge Whitfield took the codicil, examined the legal language, then looked up. "So let me understand this. The will allows Mr. Aldridge's children to inherit the estate, but denies the father, Mr. Alexander Aldridge, any decision-making authority if his actions are deemed morally harmful." Green nodded. "That is correct." The judge took a beat. "And based on today's confirmed testimony and documented events, I see no reason to dispute that Mr. Aldridge's actions meet the criteria." Lorraine's lawyer stood abruptly. "Your Honor, Ms. Carlyle intends to co-parent her child and demands to be appointed co-trustee." Judge Whitfield held up a hand. "Ms. Carlyle's behavior will be reviewed by the panel. Her public conduct, credibility, and stability will be assessed before any fiduciary rights are granted. She may be a parent, but parenthood alone does not guarantee stewardship over a fortune." Lorraine's expression curdled. Charlotte's attorney stood next. "Your Honor, Mrs. Aldridge, my client, is the lawful wife and mother of Henry Aldridge's only living grandchild. She accepts the trustee role for her son." The judge nodded. "Then, effective immediately, Mrs. Charlotte Aldridge will serve as primary trustee for her child's inheritance. Mr. Alexander Aldridge's role is suspended indefinitely subject to review." A collective silence followed, broken only by the judge's firm gavel strike. The court was adjourned. Outside, the press mobbed the courthouse steps. Lorraine stormed past them, muttering angrily into her phone. Charlotte emerged moments later, shielded by her attorney and friends. She declined interviews, eyes forward, shoulders high. Alexander lingered behind his world, imploding in silence. He had come to the hearing hoping for a resolution. What he received instead was judgment not only from the law, but from every person he had betrayed. He had gambled love for lust, trust for thrill, and now even the wealth he was raised to protect had been stripped from his hands not by a rival, but by the ghost of his father's final command. Months passed. Charlotte, though heartbroken, focused on her son, devoting herself to ensuring he received the best medical care and the most loving environment possible. With her new role as trustee, she began steering parts of the Aldridge fortune into philanthropic causes that aligned with Henry's original vision: libraries, education, and cultural preservation. In the press, she was lauded as the graceful guardian, a woman who had endured betrayal, yet stood strong for her child's legacy. Lorraine's pregnancy progressed in the glare of tabloids. She reveled in the attention at first, but quickly discovered that without Alexander's endorsement, she faced scrutiny. The trustee panel monitored her expenditures. She found that Henry's codicil had shackled her dreams of a lavish, unlimited fortune. The public grew tired of her theatrics, and the paparazzi eventually moved on. She gave birth to a daughter, but the trustee's watchful eye meant that any money spent required justification. As for Alexander, he became a nomad of sorts, traveling abroad, under the auspices of forging new business ventures, but in truth seeking refuge from the scandal he had created. He checked in on his son occasionally, sending gifts or letters, but Charlotte rarely responded. He reached out to Lorraine as well, especially after his daughter was born, but their communication was formal, coordinated through lawyers. In quiet hotel rooms from London to Singapore, Alexander reflected on how a single decision had unraveled his world. The moral clause, his father's final parting gift, forced him to confront his failings, pride, deception, and a willingness to betray the woman who loved him for fleeting passion. Some nights he'd wake from nightmares, hearing his father's voice echo, "We don't merely compete, we dominate." And he would wonder if Henry had orchestrated this punishment from the start, foreseeing the hubris that would lead his son astray. The inheritance hearing was not the end, but rather the beginning of a new era for the Aldridge name. Its future lay in the hands of two innocent children, born under the shadow of scandal, yet shielded by the wealth and legacy that Henry Aldridge left behind. And maybe, just maybe, that new generation would find a way to heal the wounds left by their father's sins, forging a path far more honorable than the one Alexander once traveled. Conclusion. Approx. 150 words. Call to action. And so ends this extraordinary saga of love and betrayal, loyalty and deception. Alexander Aldridge's fateful choice in Paris cast ripples that reshaped the future of one of Boston's wealthiest dynasties. Through a storm of secrets, heartbreak, and unexpected heirs, destiny proved stronger than any sum of money. Henry Aldridge's final testament, a moral clause no one foresaw, became the ultimate reckoning that toppled a man who once believed he could have it all. Yet in the midst of chaos, hope emerges: two children who may transcend the mistakes of their parents. Will they forge a legacy untainted by greed and lust, or remain forever haunted by the sins that birthed them? If you found this story gripping, be sure to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps bring you more thrilling tales of life's twists and turns. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned for more stories that captivate the heart and ignite the imagination.